Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the second video of this series about my course, Political Economy of the American Empire. Today, we're going to be talking about settler colonialism as, the first subject to begin our exploration of this topic. And I only want to mention one thing briefly before I actually jump into, what would be my lecture. Um, but normally before I start a lesson in a classroom, I have my students do the assigned reading, as I mentioned in the last video. So this week's reading would be Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous People's History of the United States, just the introductory chapter. And, it's free online through Google Preview. So I will also link it down below in case you're interested in going ahead and reading that. It only takes about, probably 30 minutes. And I think she does a wonderful job of getting the reader to start thinking seriously about this subject. And I personally really enjoyed it. So go ahead and read that if you'd like. But otherwise, I'm going to jump straight into, the presentation that I would normally present in the classroom. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Normally, I would have an introductory activity. I'll just mention it so you can, feel free to do it, but it's not mandatory. And then I'm going to go ahead and jump into what would be a mini lecture. And then I will just explain, some of the discussion questions that I'm posing so you can think about them. All right. So, in the introductory activity, I really just invite you guys to start thinking about what did you learn about the Native Americans and the settlers in school? And how was the story of settlement taught to you? I think talking about how it's presented in our educational system is a wonderful gauge of, what is the story that we're supposed to be hearing? So today we're going to use this really as the baseline, and then moving forward, as we continue to learn about settler colonialism and a more in-depth look at, actual settlement, hopefully we can, deconstruct some of these narratives. So if you'd like, go ahead and think about this question, but otherwise I'm going to keep moving forward. So this is my video is probably in the way, but I'm just going to leave it there. So this would be the reading that I assigned, as I mentioned. And I have 3 questions just to think about, if you'd like, in regards to the reading, which is what is her perspective on settlement in North America? And then how are settler colonialist mindsets still present today? And then, normally I would ask my students what they found interesting about the reading, but you can put that in the comment section, but it's not totally necessary. So I've done a brief outline of some of the biggest points of the reading. The first one being that Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz suggests that the extension of the United States geographically was the original intention and design of the founders. And she points to the fact that the Northwest Ordinance, which allowed them to begin settlement beyond the Appalachians and set out the procedure for colonization and, bringing new territories into statehood, that was the very first law of the Republic upon independence. And she also describes how free land was used as a magnet to attract European settlers, and of course, a specific type of settler, only white Europeans, to come to the United States and begin settlement. So in this way, she describes how there was an intentionality behind the actions of the founders. And how did the founders justify this? Well, she refers to manifest destiny and also its presence through, one, the doctrine of discovery, which was the belief that any, non-white, non-Christian occupied land could be taken by white Christian settlers. And then the origin narrative of a covenant with God, that God intended them to take the United States. In the modern day, we still confront um, what are, sort of justifications of settlement or things that brush it off. She talks about the myth of the encounter, that, it was two civilizations on equal footing that first encountered one another. And then she actually speaks to the modern day idea of multiculturalism, that Native Americans are just one amongst many cultures in the United States, disregarding their role as the first peoples. Um, and then she talks about how Euro American colonialism had from its beginnings a genocidal tendency. So she points out that the US treatment of Native Americans satisfies all terms of the Genocide Convention, and then how we continue to justify this or internalize this through modern day firsting and lasting, which is essentially regarding, um, you know, the white settlers' first school as the first school rather than those of the Native Americans, and disregarding the fact that there was Native American civilization beforehand. And then lasting would be saying that, at some point the Native Americans came to the end of the line and there was an end to them. So then she asks us to think about how might acknowledging the reality of US history work to transform society. And I really think this is our intention with this course and doing these readings and exploring these topics is to start thinking about, how is our learning going to actually, affect how we interact in society and transform our society. So I think her question here is really useful to what we're talking about. So I want to define settler colonialism to begin with. Settler colonialism is large-scale immigration for religious, political, economic reasons, and the elimination and replacement of a native population. So it's exactly what Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz called a genocidal policy. Examples of this are in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, and you can think of a few others, but those are the biggest ones. And we see this best in the statistics. There was an estimated 10 million Native Americans when the settlers first arrived, and by the year 1900, that number was closer to 300,000. And this would only be possible with this genocide and, intentional genocide, which we're going to go into in a second. I mean, we often hear that it's disease that wiped out the Native Americans, but Dunbar-Ortiz argues that it wasn't just disease, but it was intentional genocide through many policies. But we'll go into that more in detail. She also describes that settler colonialism as an institution or system requires violence or the threat of violence to attain its goals. And this is carried out through not just governmental policy, but all kinds of agencies, voluntary militias, and the settlers themselves acting on their own. So I also want to bring up this quote at the very bottom, which says, "War will cost the United States much money and some lives, but it will destroy the existence of your people as a nation forever." And this is a quote from John Sevier, the first governor of Tennessee. And the image I've placed on the right-hand side is his statue in the Capitol building. So a lot of this history is hidden in plain sight. And, narratives of disease or the encounter or multiculturalism allow us to ignore, really at its core, the genocidal policies that were a part of the founding of the United States. So how is this justified? Well, on the left-hand side, I have a quote from George Washington. He's essentially, denouncing war. And as a response to that, he says, "Rather than quarrel about territory, let the poor, the needy, and oppressed of the earth, and those who want land, resort to the fertile plains of our Western country, the second land of promise, and there dwell in peace, fulfilling the first and great commandment." So what we can think about here is the fact that it really wasn't their land to give. So what is the intention? Well, he's inviting white settlers to the United States for this mission of settler colonialism, occupation, and replacement of the native population. On the right-hand side, I have two quotes, and I'll just actually read the first one. But President Andrew Jackson says about the Native American peoples, they have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement, which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, and without appreciating the causes of their inferiority or seeking to control them, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear. So on the right-hand side, we get a contrast to what George Washington is saying on the left. Because here, Andrew Jackson is specifically talking about the inferiority of the Native Americans and saying that they have to be replaced because they're of an inferior status. So it's interesting how, important race and, these racial stereotypes that they've put on Native Americans are to justifying this mission of replacing Native Americans and of bringing white settlers at the same time to replace them demographically. So I wanted to also bring up this quote from Ayn Rand, and she says about the Native Americans, "What was it they were fighting for if they opposed white men on this continent? For their wish to continue a primitive existence, their right to keep part of the earth untouched, unused, and not even as property? Just keep everybody out so that you will live practically like an animal, or maybe a few caves above it. Any white person who brought the element of civilization had a right to take over this continent." And this is a quote from 1974. So it's not so long ago that we're still hearing these kinds of justifications. And Ayn Rand is still a popular intellectual today, and her ideologies are still relevant. So it's important to remember that these ideas don't go away and they're internalized. And right here, she's talking about the justification of white settlers to take Native American land because, they consider Native Americans primitive, but especially because their economic system isn't one that uses land as property or capitalizes on it. So, we'll see this ideology come up later on as we talk about the economic effects, actually. But it's quite interesting to see how these ideas continue onward from those, first presidents, right? All right. So what are the policies that allow settler colonialism to take place? Well, we know in 1787, the Northwest Ordinance lays out the colonization procedure, and it says that settlers must outnumber natives for statehood, saying from the beginning that, you have to decrease the native population and you have to replace them with white Americans. And this sets this violent genocidal policy into motion. And there's two ways then that this was carried out and that these lands were brought into the United States. Well, the first one was natives were forced to cede lands in treaties, often with bogus signatures or through bribery. So, the government would recognize someone from the tribe who wasn't even necessarily, the leader of the tribe, and then they would get their signatures and say, well, we have the signature from Native American leadership. Or they would bribe them, individual members, and get their signature with, whatever goods. This was also the result of, economic isolation and debt. So they would intentionally cut off Native American trade routes and keep them from accessing the land that they could live off of, to put them in such economic isolation that they had no choice but to sign the treaty and move elsewhere. Or other methods were mass murder, looting and burning, raping women, stealing children away for slavery. And when Native Americans or those leaders who signed the treaties did, cede their lands, they often never received the federal government payment. And we'll talk about what happens to that payment later on. So another way, the second way that land was taken is through the use of federal legislation and executive order to take the land. So you've probably heard about this with Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears. But, many presidents took these policies. And what they would do is force Native Americans into what were concentration camps. And it's interesting to remember that, the US's treatment of Native Americans and the reservation system was the basis that, Hitler looked back to when he then makes the concentration camps in Germany. But yes, they move them into concentration camps and they force them further and further west as the United States expands. By 1850, they have this land on the western coast that they've just taken through war, which is Mexico, which was once Mexico. So they've taken this land through the Mexican-American War, and they have this land on the east side that they've been gradually moving west and west. But, there's this whole area of land in the center where Native Americans are still living. And as, US citizens start going to California, in the gold rush especially, they're having this problem where the Native Americans are in the way. So they force Native Americans into the reservation system, into smaller and smaller areas, kind of cordoning them off from the rest of white America. So there's one more policy that is really, like the final act in this series of events. The Dawes Act in 1887 privatizes collective indigenous land. So the official statement about it was, we're going to civilize Native Americans, we're going to give them individual property, and they'll learn to be good capitalists. When they do this, part of their intention was, they parcel off the land, one person gets this, another person gets this, but whatever, hasn't been parceled out, the surplus is then sold off to white settlers. So you see this ad on the left-hand side, that is from this period of time. And at this point, Native Americans lose 80% of their remaining land, and what they're left with is entirely economically unviable. So I'd like to show a video, the history of land theft, or as the video calls it, the invasion of America. And I'm going to speed it up because it's quite a slow video. So at this point, the two policies are through treaties and through executive order. And at this point, we see the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, where they take what is now California. And then the rise of the reservation system. And that is the effect of the Dawes Act. So I'd like to talk about now the economic effects. Well, the first big thing that happens is what was once sacred land is turned into a commodity, real estate. So we have a quote here from Crowfoot. He's the chief of the Blackfeet. And around the year 1885, releases a statement that says, "As long as the sun shines and the waters flow, this land will be here to give life to men and animals. We cannot sell the lives of men and animals, therefore we cannot sell this land. It was put here for us by the Great Spirit, and we cannot sell it because it does not belong to us." So hopefully, this quote gives you an understanding of what it meant for this land to be sacred and why it wasn't sold like a commodity. Well, when the United States comes, they do turn it into a commodity. They give money for the treaties, and then they buy and sell this land. So land, as it becomes a commodity, becomes the primary source of wealth for the United States government. So all, the wars that are carried out, all the policies, majority of the funding is coming from this land that has been taken from Native Americans. It is also the primary source of wealth for settlers, for Americans. And so real estate became but it also remains the basis of wealth in the United States. So unfortunately, I couldn't find statistics on land ownership in general. What I could find was home ownership statistics. And we know that it is the greatest source of wealth. And, we still see disparities to this day. White Americans have the highest home ownership rates. Native Americans' home ownership rates are significantly lower. If a Native American lives on a reservation, very rarely can they own their own land due to trust status, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks. But I have these statistics on the right-hand side where you can see this is white home ownership and this is Native American home ownership. And on the upper right is statistics about housing quality. And you see in every category, the general US quality of housing, really outdoes Native American quality of housing. So, like, this is a statistic about, is the household lacking a kitchen in their home? Well, 9% of Native American households are versus 0.7% of general American households. And it goes for plumbing, for, telephone, and then also for, this is about overcrowding. Unfortunately, my video is covering it. But yeah, so we see these statistics across the board. Now, what are the effects on white America at the time? So I want to start drawing this connection. Without land theft, without the land they're taking from the Native Americans, you do not see the growth of the plantation system. A lot of the push west is because, plantation owners, slave owners are gradually taking more and more land to grow their plantations, to produce cotton. So the expansion of the territories really goes hand in hand with the demand for land by plantation owners. Additionally, something interesting about this is there's a class aspect to it. The frontier became the escape valve for poor Americans who served as foot soldiers west. So, because these Americans didn't have slaves, they couldn't compete in cotton markets, they couldn't compete in agricultural markets. And also, because as industry comes about, instead factory owners opt to use cheap migrant labor that they can exploit, there's no room for Americans there. So this pushes them further and further west. At the same time, we see, settlers take control of indigenous cultivated farmland and resources. So this idea that the United States was just this barren land there for the taking, uncultivated by Native Americans, what you see in that Ayn Rand quote is absolutely not true. So the settlers like co-opt these resources and this farmland, and I say and continue to benefit. All of us continue to benefit to this day. What are the effects on Native Americans? Well, Native Americans are reduced to destitution in order to force treaties. So I show these trade routes on the right-hand side. All of these, they're blocked off so that they have no choice but to cede to treaties. Traditional ways of economic livelihood, economic provisioning were ended. And yeah, the trade routes were disrupted. There was the purposeful decimation of economic resources, which on the last slide you would have seen a picture of, all of the buffalo that had been killed by people going west. So this was a way of subsistence for Native Americans that was completely wiped out. Land was burned, there was looting, they killed livestock, so that Native Americans had no choice but to die or move west. Sorry, those are really harsh terms, but that was the intention. It was a genocide. It was basically genocide. Also, I mentioned earlier, tribes were often not awarded the treaty money. Well, what the United States would do is, we're signing this treaty and I'm going to give you all this money, but we're going to hold it for you. And the United States would then, later, much of this was speculated on railroads and entirely lost. So they never saw any of that money. Also, Native Americans were removed to economically unviable land through the reservation system. So, whatever, land had resources on it, could be cultivated, was taken or specifically by the US government put aside, and everything else was given to the Native Americans. But we know later on that the US government continues to encroach on Native American land because they realize that, oh, actually, there's resources on that land we didn't know about. But the Native Americans are reduced to dependence on the federal government. They have no way of providing for themselves on this land. And, we'll talk about the implications of this in 2 weeks, specifically through, um, yeah, trust status. What is trust status and the trust doctrine? But yes, they're essentially dependent then on the federal government, which was the intention. In the modern day, Native American poverty is on par with that of sub-Saharan Africa at 25%. So I put these two maps up to show that we see, the concentration of poverty is often where we find reservations today. And then in terms of statistics on poverty rates, the US government today, as the total US population today, it's about 15% here. For all Native Americans, it's about 30%. And for those on reservations, it's about a 40% poverty rate. So we're gonna stop at, the beginning of the reservation system, because today we're talking about land theft and we're talking about settler colonialism. And then in 2 weeks, we're returning to this topic to talk about policies towards Native Americans from the reservation system onward. But I'd like to show this video because I think it's important to hear, Native American voices on this subject and to understand that this isn't that long ago. And also that it's something that continues to affect, Native Americans to this day. So here is a video that we can watch to get a sense for this.
Reservation. Damnation. Bleak.
Oppression.
Small. Small. They're beautiful and sad at the same time. It's beautiful because you're surrounded by people that are just like you. But it's sad because everything that affects big cities, whether it's drugs or alcohol or everything's magnified on a reservation. You see it up front, like in your face.
Sick. There's alcoholism, there's abuse, there's domestic violence, there's a lot of things that go on a reservation that really goes overlooked.
Just a compromise. It was an agreement forced agreement probably, that Native Americans were put kind of out of the way, out of sight.
Prison. It's like where we're trapped.
What is the most common misconception about reservations?
That there's some kind of abundance, that natives are happy, that they're caring for each other, that they live in some ancient way.
Ooh, sad.
Poor.
A concentration camp. Reservations were made to isolate Indian people and hope that we would die off.
Depressing.
Unfair, because they're not as good as other lands. They're the land that the government and people don't want.
Trapped. It wasn't great farmland, it wasn't great homeland. And so it kind of feels like a place off to the side.
Even to this day, the natives are fighting for rights to keep the little what they have.
There are no good reservations. Here's your reservation. You can't go across that boundary. This is your reservation. And I grew up on a Navajo reservation, and we're one of the few lucky people that got to remain where our homelands are. But there are other reservations where people were forced there. And They can't fend for themselves like they used to do in the old days. You can't hunt anymore, you can't fish anymore, because you're just stuck on a reservation on these substandard housing, living in third world country conditions. Youths killing themselves because there's no future, there's no hope. That's a reservation to me.
All right. So now I would like to move on to, what would be a discussion that I would like to have in the classroom, but I invite you to just think about these questions yourself. And I'd like to start by actually, reading this article. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in, again, the description box so that you can go ahead and read it. And it's a very short article, but, I think it's very eye-opening. And it talks about the fact that the United States, actually has begun acknowledging genocides that they've perpetuated in other countries, but still fails to acknowledge the genocide of Native Americans in the United States. So, after reading that, there's a few questions to think about, which is, why does America struggle to acknowledge Native genocide? In what ways is this genocide actually ongoing today? What steps can be taken to heal and overcome, and how do we go beyond apologies and promote real action? And then who have to be the major players? And then in what ways? So these are the questions that, I think are important to think about in regards to this subject. And, feel free to write in the comments section and put your thoughts there. But, I hope these questions will get you thinking a little bit about this subject. And I'd actually like to stop there. All right. So thank you so much for listening. I know it's quite a heavy subject, but I hope I, in some sense, did justice to it and that this has been helpful to you. But yes, please go read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's writing. Please go read, the discussion article from, I believe it's Peter D'Errico. Those are great resources to hear what real scholars are saying about these subjects. But, I hope you gain something from this. I think it's important that we all start learning about, the origins of the United States and the impact that it's had continuing up to this day. So thank you so much. And in our next video, I will be talking about slavery. And we're going to start to build the connection between, settler colonialism and land theft to slavery, and then to the rise of industry in the United States, and why you can't have the industrialization of the United States without these first two parts. So that should be a really interesting video. And there's two possible videos you can watch actually in replacement for, an actual reading. And one of them is Edward E. Baptist, his talk at, Google, where he talks about his book, The Half Has Never Been Told. And that's mostly in regards to the rise of slavery as kind of the foundation of capitalism in the United States and its importance in the US economy. And the second one is Dr. Joy DeGroy's talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she really talks about how the original founders justified slavery, especially in a country where they'd already written a document saying all men were created equal. So how did they justify this? And then how, I think, have we internalized these justifications? And then the effects through post-traumatic slave syndrome. So, choose either of these if you'd like and go ahead and watch them, or choose both. I think they're both really wonderful resources. And then we can go ahead and get started talking about slavery and its connections to what we talked about today, settler colonialism. So thank you so much, and I hope you'll continue watching these videos. Bye.